So welcome, Jesma. She's going to be speaking to us on anti-Semitism and the face of that in the world today. So thank you, Jesma.
Thank you. Good to be with you tonight again. John and I head back to the warmth of the Sunshine Coast on Saturday. But we always enjoy our time in New Zealand. A long way back on my mother's side of the family, I'm not sure if I told you last week, but my mother's ancestors were in the group of the first Anglican missionaries to the Bay of Islands in the 1800s and set up businesses. Numbers of them are buried in Russell. And so we've enjoyed going there and finding their gravestones and have quite an interesting history connected to New Zealand. And over many years have travelled with some of you will know Rachel and Bill Millward, and also Derek and Ruth McDowell, late Ruth McDowell, crisscrossed New Zealand from top to bottom, just teaching about Israel, which is always a real joy and a real blessing. And I think it's really important at the moment to be praying for Israel. The latest news that I had this morning was talking about the fact that with the problems on the Gazan border, the Hamas are really trying to incite Israel to react by they've sent 400 kites over, setting fire to about 9,000 dunams of land, of farmland, destroying forests, and they've also been putting explosives into the kites as well, really trying to do maximum damage along the border, the Gazan border. And Israel has managed to stop, of the 400, have stopped 200, I think it is, that they've actually been able to stop. Or 200 got through, actually 400 they stopped, 200 got through. But what will happen, of course, is you don't keep allowing people to do that on your border and destroying farmland and destroying forestry. So eventually they will retaliate and the army will go in, and then Israel will be painted in the UN and in the media as the bad guy, as always. And that's a face of anti-Semitism in the world today as well. And so tonight I thought we would look at the war against the Jews, which also, in another sense, it's a paradox, but it's God's miracle, the Jews, because despite this constant war of anti-Semitism down through the ages, they're still here, they're still surviving, they're still blessing the world with their technology and with the medical discoveries and the agricultural discoveries. They're still the nation that will, almost before anybody else, get to trouble spots when there's been a natural disaster. You'll still find Jewish medical teams there. You'll find them in Africa giving their agricultural expertise. So despite this constant war against them, this tiny people survive. And on the walls of the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv, Abakovna, who was one of the poets coming out of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in the Second World War, said, "This is the story of a people which was scattered over all the world and yet remained a single family. The nation which, time and again, was doomed to destruction and yet out of ruins rose to new life." And we see that over and over again. So the history, and John and I absolutely love history, and we love digging into the past, and I think the past, an understanding of the past, helps us to understand where we are in the present and where we're headed to in the future. If we don't understand our past, we actually will find it very hard to understand where we're headed and what's happening, the forces that are round about us. And someone once said that he who doesn't learn from history is bound to repeat it. And that's absolutely true. We see in the world today, and wherever the world, pardon me, I did about 3.5 hours teaching this morning, so my voice is telling on me. But we're still seeing the world when they didn't learn from the lessons of the Holocaust. We're still seeing the genocide of nations in Rwanda and in Cambodia, and it's almost like the Jews are God's test nation to test the world and the church to see if we'll accept his sovereignty and accept the lessons of history. So we see that these people, according to the prophet Balaam, who was sent by the king to curse the people, always ends up blessing them, and he calls them a people who were destined to dwell apart. And it took both Isaac and Jacob, both required a miracle to be conceived in the first place. Esau desires to kill his brother Jacob. Jacob has to escape into exile to survive and give life to the 12 tribes through his sons. We know the story that famine chases that family into Egypt, where the pattern for anti-Semitism is established, way back in the times of the pharaohs, when in Exodus 1, 8-10, we're told, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph, but said to his people, 'Come, let's use wisdom in dealing with them, otherwise they will continue to multiply. And in the event of war, they might ally themselves with our enemies, fight against us and leave the land altogether.'" And this is about between 1400 and 1200 BC. So in a sense, Pharaoh, like many rulers after him, is saying that the Jews who had settled in Egypt to escape the famine were too dangerous to keep. They were frightened to keep them, but they were too valuable to lose. So they become, there's this paradox of what do you do with the Jewish people? So Pharaoh's decision, his way of dealing with the Jewish problem was to enslave the people, get them building the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, and then he issues a decree that they are to kill all the little boy babies. And this way the girls would marry into Egypt and the Egyptian people would disappear. So it's really the Israeli people would disappear. And so we see that this pattern has been repeated over and over throughout history. And it's a beautiful story when you see that there would have been no Moses without the amazing, courageous women who risked their lives and stood up against Pharaoh to stop this happening. The two midwives who lied to Pharaoh and said, "Oh well, the Israelite women, they give birth too quickly, so they've given birth before ever we get there, so we can't kill the babies." They stand up, and they're the first, in a sense, they fight for social justice issues on behalf of the unborn babies. And then, of course, there's his mother, Jochebed, again, who hides the baby, stands up, this slave woman stands up against the might of Pharaoh to hide this baby boy that she knows is destined for greatness. His big sister, Miriam, imagine a little girl, and she has the courage to stand up to Pharaoh's daughter and to think on her feet and take advantage of the situation. "Would you like me to go and get one of the Hebrew women?" That's really something for a little slave girl to think like that and to take the initiative. And then, of course, there's Pharaoh's daughter himself, who takes this baby boy, and she actually she puts him under the care of the very man whose plan is to murder him. It's really Moses, above all, that Pharaoh, without realizing it, is trying to kill. So it's an amazing story. And this always happens in the story of the Jewish people, that whenever God is about to send a redeemer, a leader, then someone will try and destroy the people. And this is exactly what happened when Moses was being born. It was an attempt, in a way, to prevent them from returning to the land of Israel. So we know because we're able to look back at the story, but they weren't aware of all of these forces in play at the time, because God is planning, it's time for them to return to the land, not as slaves, but as a kingdom of priests and as a holy nation. It's time to go back. They're going to be led by this little baby Moses, who is actually protected and educated in the very household of the man who really wants to murder him. And in a sense, the people who are involved, they don't understand the spiritual forces that are involved during all that's happening at this time. But Pharaoh set in motion a pattern that we still see as the Holocaust is worked out in the 20th century. The use of slave labour, because Pharaoh caused the people to become slaves, starvation and slaughter of the children. During the Second World War, during the time of the Holocaust, 1.5 million little Jewish children were killed. I don't know if any of you have been, I'm sure you have, to the Hall of the Children at Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. And as you walk through, there's light reflected, the light from, I think it's a single candle, but it reflects the 1.5 in such a way, it reflects the 1.5 million children. And as you walk through in the dark, the names and the birthdays of these children are read out, and it takes 4 years of the tape playing 24 hours a day to speak out the names of all of these children who were murdered for no other reason than that they were Jewish. And it was Pharaoh who set the pattern that Hitler picked up at that particular time. But then, of course, in 483 to about 473 BC, we have Haman the Agagite. And he's an interesting fellow. He's the Grand Vizier of in Persia. And he's actually a descendant. You remember that Saul was told to kill the Agagite kings, and he doesn't do it. And Samuel has to do the job for him. And of course that Saul loses the throne to David. But it's a descendant of Agag, Haman, who once again becomes a player in the story of trying to eliminate the Jewish people. But God is always the God of second chances, because he uses Esther and Mordecai, who are descendants of Saul, to actually do the job that Saul should have done in dealing with Haman. And it's Haman's idea as well. He says, there is a particular people scattered and dispersed among the peoples of the provinces of your kingdom. He's speaking to King Ahasuerus. He says, their laws are different from those of every other people's. Moreover, they don't observe the king's laws. It doesn't befit the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, have a decree written for their destruction. We find those words in the book of Esther, chapter 3, verses 8 to 9. The pattern continues. Assimilation, it doesn't work. There are people who are called to be set apart, so let's try and destroy them instead. Haman says they're different from everybody. It's what happened to the Jews in Christian Europe when they were the only non-Christian minority in Europe at that time, and they're seen by the Christian church, which had moved from being disciples of Jesus to a political force that we could call Christendom. And again, the Jews are seen as a threat. So the Jews, again, they're returning to Israel to rebuild the temple in preparation for the coming of Messiah. And it's Haman who tries to block that from happening, and again calls for their destruction. In the 2nd century BC, the Seleucids under Antiochus Epiphanes, and the Seleucids, of course, came after Alexander the Great, whose desire was to see Greek culture spread throughout the world, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek religion. And even though he died in his early 30s, he succeeded quite well, really, because we actually, the way our worldview in the West is very much a Greek classical worldview. But Antiochus Epiphanes, he swept into Judea, and he outlawed Torah study. He outlawed the keeping of the Sabbath, circumcision, again, an attempt to cause assimilation. And you would almost think he succeeded, because one day they actually couldn't have the afternoon sacrifices in the temple. They had built a gymnasium next to the temple, and too many of the priests were actually going down to the gym to hold the sacrifices. At that time, instead of using biblical names, many little Jewish boys and girls were given Greek names, and people, they wanted to be like the Greeks. They wanted to be like the other nations. So this leads us again to this picture of either make them assimilate or we're going to destroy them. Then again, approximately 8 to 4 BC, we have Herod. And he is the story of the wise men in Matthew chapter 2. And he like his predecessors, gives orders to kill the baby boys under 2 in Bethlehem. Again, an attempt to destroy the Messiah, God's king, at his first coming. In the 1st century AD, the Romans, under firstly Titus and then Hadrian, destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. Judea is called, which means praise to Yahweh. It's renamed by Hadrian as Philistina, because he understands that the Jews have a covenant connection with the land. So Israel means one who has wrestled with God and man and prevailed. Judah or Yehuda, it means praise to Yahweh. He senses that there's some kind of a spiritual connection. So he wants to destroy that, to cut them, to separate them from their covenant relationship with the God of the land and the land. And so he renames it Palestina, which comes from their ancient enemies, the Philistines. And it appears periodically. There has never really been a land of Palestine in the Middle East. But the name changed over time under the Ottomans. It was all an area of Syria. When the British took over the mandate in the early 20th century, they call it the Palestinian or the Palestine Mandate. And it stuck. The Arab peoples who lived in the area after 1964, when the Palestine Liberation Organization was begun by Yasser Arafat, they adopt the name Palestinians, but it wasn't there before. It's really good for us to actually understand the history of that name. But Hadrian also changes the name of Jerusalem, which means foundation of Shalom. God calls it the place where I have chosen to place my name in the book of Ezekiel. And it's interesting that Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim, it's a plural word, and it means a pair of Jerusalems, the Jerusalem above and the Jerusalem on the earth. It's a real picture of God's redemptive purposes. But he changes Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and he forbids all the Jewish people to go there, except on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. Hadrian also forbids, like Antiochus Epiphanes, Torah study, circumcision of the baby boys, a sign of the covenant. The Sabbath observance is forbidden, and the people are sent into the nations as slaves. And Jesus had talked about this happening when he says in Luke 21, 20-24, "However, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you are to understand that she is about to be destroyed. Those in Judea must escape to the hills, and those inside the city must get out. Those in the country must not enter it, for these are days of vengeance, when everything that has been written in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, will come true. What a terrible time it will be for nursing mothers, for there will be great distress in the land and judgment on the people. Some will fall by the edge of the sword, others will be carried into all the countries of the Gentiles, and Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the age of the Gentiles has run its course." So again we see the threads of destruction and assimilation played out in the history, in the story of this people, as God establishes them as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, as his, in a sense, they're carriers of his name. And they're a reminder nation that God is the king of the universe. There's a Middle Eastern custom that is based on the fact that if you want someone to understand that you own all of something, then you take a small portion and you put your name on it. It's the same way that farmers will tattoo their brand name on cattle and on sheep. Or they'll put a clip in their ear so that amongst all the herds, people know that, oh well, that cow belongs to this particular farmer. And in the Middle East, if you want to establish ownership, you put something of yourself or your name, or you plant some trees or something like that on a small portion to show that you own the whole lot. And God says of the Jewish people, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And he tattoos his name, Israel, one who has wrestled with God and man and prevailed on the land and on the people. It also comes from the Hebrew root for the royal family, a prince, Sar Shalom, the Prince of Peace, Sarah, a princess. He places his name on the land. He places it also on the city of Jerusalem. Of all the cities, he says, this is the place where I have chosen to place my name. He tells the people you can't sell the land into perpetual ownership in Leviticus 23 because the land is mine. You're just the caretakers. And of course, the Jewish people, Israelis, they carry God's name, but also they're called Jews, and that comes from the word Yehudim, which means praise to Yahweh, the God of grace. So God is acting like a Middle Eastern potentate, and he's saying, all the earth is mine, and I'm going to take this little people, this little city, this little country, and they're going to be a reminder to the world that I'm in charge here. Whether you like it or not, I am sovereign, I'm the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And so this is why you have this battle, in a sense, between the powers of darkness down through the ages, trying to prevent the purposes of God from being fulfilled in this tiny land, through this tiny people, who are less than half of 1% of the world's population. Who would really care? Nobody cares too much about what's happening in New Zealand. They don't care that much. If you're in Africa, you never hear about what's happening in Australia. We really don't count all that much. And yet the news is always there. Hundreds of thousands of people can be being killed in Syria, being displaced. But if one situation happens on the border with Gaza, with Israel, it's on every news outlet. And we have to recognise that it's because there's this battle over who's in charge, and they are, in a sense, victims of God's sovereignty, because God has chosen them to remind the world that he exists, that his word is true, and that he keeps his promises. So when we move on to the establishment of the church, and we don't have time tonight, it took us 3 hours today to get through this journey. But when we get to the 2nd century, between the 2nd and the 6th century, the early church fathers, they have no understanding that, in a sense, our roots, as Paul said in Romans 11, he writes the book of Romans, and we need to understand the background there, that Romans was written because the early church was, the message of the gospel was taken by the Jewish believers, including Peter, to Rome, and they set up the Messianic community there. And the leaders, of course, are Jews, and they have an understanding of the Hebrew scriptures, they have an understanding of Messiah, they have an understanding of the purposes of God. But they keep having fights with the non-believing Jews who haven't accepted Jesus as Messiah. So the emperor gets fed up and kicks them all out of Rome. So the church that was led by Jewish believers is now led by Gentile believers who actually don't have the understanding of the faith. They're new Christians. So Paul has to come back in, and he has to write the epistle to the Romans. And the first 8 chapters, of course, speak about salvation by grace through faith. That's a magnificent book. But he changes tack in chapter 9 and through to 11 to remind this now Gentile church of the importance in God's heart to the Jewish people. He hasn't rejected his people. He's fulfilling his purposes. He hasn't rejected them. It's all part of his plan so that Gentiles could come into the knowledge of God. And he says, don't be arrogant or wise in your own conceits, because it's not you who are supporting the root, it's the root who's supporting you. And the Greek word bastasio for support, it's actually, it paints a picture like the placenta in a mother's womb that brings out all the life-giving nutrients to a baby in its mother's womb. And it says that's the support that you have. It's the root, your roots in ancient, the faith of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and the scriptures. There's no New Testament at this time. This is the foundation of your faith, and he's reminding the Gentile church and us today of the debt that we owe to the Jewish people. But The early church fathers, Origen, Augustine, Jerome, they had no understanding of all of this, and they begin preaching horrific sermons against the Jews. And again, it's either assimilate to Christianity or be destroyed. There was no other choice. If a Jewish person came to Jesus as Lord and Saviour, then they were expected to renounce their Jewishness, renounce their family, and put themselves under a curse if they went back to following any of their Jewish traditions. It was a very difficult time for them. Hippolytus, who was later canonised, accused them of deicide, of killing God. And that's the 3rd century AD, and that accusation has stayed right to the present day, where some elderly Jewish people that we know in Australia said when we were in primary school, we were called, the kids were calling us Christ killers, and we had no idea what they were talking about. We hadn't killed anybody, but this accusation has followed them down through the ages. Chrysostom, who was called the Golden Tongue, actually used 8 sermons against the Jews, where he calls the synagogue a whorehouse and a theatre, a den of thieves and a haunt of wild animals. He likens the Jewish people to pigs. He calls them gluttons, and just horrible accusations that are really crass and certainly not golden-tongued in any ways. And as time went on, the early church fathers taught. And remember, people don't have the Bible. It's written by this stage only in Latin, and most people are illiterate. They actually don't know what the Bible says. They only know what they're being told by these men who they look up to as the fathers of the faith. And they're told that the Jews were not human, that they were demons incarnate, and they were cast off by God into utter darkness. So building this history of anti-Semitism. Augustine, in the 5th century, he's regarded as really the one who established a lot of church doctrine. He says the Jews are incapable of understanding the true nature of the Bible. They're enemies of God. And one of the earliest historians, and we get a lot of great primary source material from Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea on the coast, the Mediterranean coast, and you can visit the ruins of Caesarea today if you go to Israel. But he was actually teaching that Jesus and Abraham and all the patriarchs were Christians, and that they were totally different, the Hebrews were totally different from the Jews of the day. He says, the Jews' kingdom has been destroyed, the Torah has been destroyed, and the ancient worship uprooted. So consequently, according to the church, they began to believe that they had replaced Israel as the elect of God. And all of the promises that the Old Testament held, they took for themselves, and we still see it in some of the translations of our Bible today, where there'll be a passage that speaks specifically about God's love for the Jewish people, and you see that the heading will say God's love for the church. Or speaking specifically about Israel, or God's heart for the church. And one of the worst places you see this is in Ezekiel 37, which is the story of the Holocaust and the restoration of Israel. And it speaks about the valley of dry bones. It speaks about the people who were coming out of the Holocaust as literally dry bones. And you get ministers preaching that this is the church being restored and being revived. And it's not meant to be anti-Semitic, but it is. It's built on the foundations that I've actually been talking about at this particular time. Marcion came along in about the 2nd century, and he thought the Old Testament should be obliterated altogether because the God of the Old Testament was different from the God of the New Testament. And there are still people who believe that today. They'll say, I'm a New Testament Christian. But you actually can't be a New Testament Christian because our faith is built on the Tanakh, on the Hebrew Scriptures. So we see over time the demonization and the rejection of Israel as a people. It sets the stage for the horrific persecutions that followed. And again, the plan, assimilate or be destroyed. And in Jeremiah 50, it said, their enemy said, we aren't guilty, for they sinned against the Lord. So people actually thought that they were doing God's work by destroying the Jewish people. And you see it today, that fundamentalist Islam, in the same vein, believes that they are doing Allah's work by destroying the infidels. So the history of the Jews of Europe following those times, we know the story of the Crusades, and when whole communities in the path of the Crusaders were destroyed under the sign of the cross. The Jews had been spread through the diaspora all around the Mediterranean region. Then they began to move as they were persecuted up into the Netherlands, across into England. They were prospering in all these countries. They prospered particularly under Islam in its golden age, and they were the merchants, they were the physicians, the financiers. They did very well. But with the Inquisition, of course, that changed, and they were on the move once again. But the Pope, once the Muslims were in control in the Holy Land, the Pope called for holy crusades. And this word crusade is an absolute horror to both Jews and Muslims, because it reminds them of the time when the Crusaders, and even before they'd left England, they had actually herded the Jews of York, who were a very prosperous community, into the cathedral and killed them all. And as they moved across through the Rhineland, through what is now Germany, they killed whole communities that had been there for hundreds of years. And they did it under the sign of the cross. When they got to Jerusalem, they herded the Jewish people into the synagogue and set fire to it. They killed the Muslims on Temple Mount, and then we're told that they marched singing praises to Christ to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, covered in blood. And they really, when we understand that this is our history, we're dealing with issues like Islamic fundamentalism today, we have to understand that we actually have only one message, and that is grace. It's by grace we've been saved through faith. We can't actually criticise anybody else. I read a history of the British Army in Afghanistan, and all the things that ISIS have been doing throughout the Middle East. The British Army actually did similar things. They're horrific, the things that they did to the women and the children in Afghanistan as they retreated at that time. So as Christians, we have to be really careful not to think we're doing God's will by getting political. We need to understand our history, but we are called to build the kingdom of God. I remember some years ago there was an election. We were in Israel and we were at a Messianic fellowship on a Saturday, and one of the Messianic pastors said that God had really challenged him on the fact that he hadn't called him to be liberal or Labour. He had actually challenged him to build the kingdom of God. And we have to be really careful, because God is not willing that any should perish. And knowing our history should humble us. Because when God speaks about the Jewish people, he actually says that when you went out amongst the nations, you profaned my name. And to profane God's name means to give him a bad reputation. And we have to be really careful that we don't give God a bad reputation by being racist against Muslims, by acting as if the church has always been fantastic, because some people know our history better than we do. And there's one Jewish scholar who said that the very pages in the history books that the Christians have torn out, the Jews have underlined. Yeah. And so it's good to understand these things. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council continued the fight against the Jewish people. In 1290, all Jews were expelled from England and remained expelled until the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell allowed them back into the country. The 16th century Martin Luther, he starts off and he thinks that he's just had this amazing revelation that it's not through keeping works, it's not by selling indulgences or any of those things, but it's salvation by grace through faith. He's had this amazing what do you call the word? Revelation. That's what I want. And he thinks, I'm preaching the true gospel now, the Jews will accept it. But of course the Jews don't. And he writes this most horrific, 4 days before he died, this most horrific sermon, a little pamphlet, in which he actually lays down the framework which Hitler used for in the Nuremberg laws at the beginning of his attack against destroying the Jews of Europe. And so many of these things, the Inquisition in 14th and 15th century Spain, 16th century Eastern Europe, Russia and Poland, the Jews were herded. The first ghettos were actually put in place in Venice by the Pope to separate the Jews from everybody else. But then in Poland, they were all forced to live in the Pale of Settlement, which meant that Christmas and Easter, they were sitting ducks. And just like Muslim crowds will come out of the mosque after being whipped up by their mullahs on a Friday, this is what happened in Poland during this particular period, and the Christian mobs would come out of their church services at Easter and Christmas, and the Jews were terrified because it was there that they destroyed their businesses, that they destroyed their homes, that they beat up their families. Little children were taken from as young as 2, they were kidnapped from the front of their yards, and they were taken into the Russian army, and they had to serve there for 20 years. The Tsar of Russia, with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, worked out that they could forcibly baptize half the Jews and allow the other half to starve. And that would be their way of getting rid of the Jews. The Jews had to pay tithes to the church in many of these countries, and twice as much in tax as the Christians. So you can see this, again, this continual assimilate or be destroyed, which leads in the end to the 20th century, to the Holocaust, where Hitler writes in Mein Kampf that he's only doing properly what the church had failed to do for the last 2,000 years. And he asks some bishops in France, do you have any problem with what I intend to do? And to the Jews, and they said no. And so the world doesn't speak up, and we can't just blame the Germans because in 1939 there was a conference in Evian, and Golda Meir was there, and she said, listening to all the countries, they knew they had a pretty good idea of what was going to happen to the Jews of Europe as Hitler came to power. My country, Australia, said we don't have a racial problem and we don't want to get one, so they took 5,000 children, but 1.5 million died. Whole boatloads were sent back, went to America and were sent back to Europe where they perished in the gas ovens. Canada wasn't interested in helping out either. All of the countries had an opportunity, and for the most part they declined. There was the railroad, the secret railroad, taking a lot of children into England. But again, the countries of the West knew what was happening, and they refused to bomb the railway lines that were taking the Jews to their death in the gas ovens. They could easily have bombed them. They chose not to. So as Christian Jews were slaughtered along with their non-Christian Jewish relations, they thought that by becoming Christians they were safe, but by this point in time, it's no longer assimilation on offer, it's only destruction. So Franklin Littell says this, a scholar of history, a Christian, he says, it's not possible to love a spiritual Israel and hate the earthly Israel. It's not possible to honour and obey the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and wish evil on the Jewish people. To lay it on the line, it's not possible to side with those who seek Jerusalem's destruction and be numbered a faithful Christian. It was not possible in the Germany of the Third Reich, and it's not possible today. Amen. And that leads us to today, the 21st century. Now, this is a fairly sombre message tonight for a Wednesday evening, a cold Wednesday evening, but I believe that it's important that we understand, because we Christians, we actually represent God in the world. And we are responsible for his reputation amongst believers, whether they're Jewish or not, or Muslim. We are responsible for God's reputation. And in the 21st century, anti-Semitism has taken a different slant, and it's actually turned into anti-Israelism. So where the Jew was seen as a threat to Europe and the world, previously, now it's Israel that's seen as a threat. This tiny nation, 28,000 square kilometres, it fits 10 times into New Zealand. It fits 4 times into the tiniest of our states in Tasmania, in Australia. Tiny little nation, and surrounded by Arab countries that are about 14.5 million square kilometres. About 8 million people at this point in time. Okay? Oh, it's okay. That's better. Yep, that's better. Thank you. And so anti-Israelism has taken the place, in a sense, of anti-Semitism, but it's the same because its aims are the same. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and yet so many democracies won't stand with her. She's only in the middle, 10 kilometres wide from one side, one border to the other, the Jordanian border to the Mediterranean Sea. She has to be able to protect herself from countries where they're teaching their children, and you can see the maps that the kids are studying from. Israel doesn't exist in school books in Egypt, doesn't exist in Jordan. It's simply, it's not there. And there are many of the airlines are told that when they have their maps in their books, they're not allowed to actually put Israel there. It's what China's doing today. It gets upset with airlines if they put Hong Kong and Taiwan and Macau as separate states. Well, the same thing happens to Israel. They're not, so you'll find these maps and Israel simply doesn't exist. And so first of all, we need to re-establish the basis for all anti-Semitism, no matter how it's expressed, as anti-Israelism or as anti-Semitism. It's a challenge to the sovereignty of God, who's called this people, this land and this city of Jerusalem to be, in a sense, his stones of remembrance. In Hebrew, Mazaboth, when the patriarchs were travelling around the land, they stopped at important places and they erected stone altars called Mazaboths. They were to remind them of what God had done for them in the past. And when they returned there, they would take time to worship God and to remember what he had done. And in a sense, Israel is God's Mazaboth, or stone of remembrance, down through the ages, because God has called them to birth his redemptive purposes. He's given us, Paul tells us in Romans 9, 4-5, the scriptures, the covenants are theirs, the patriarchs are theirs, the promises are theirs, the Shekinah, the glory of God, it's all there in the Old Testament scriptures. And of course Paul finishes and he says, and the Messiah. And so we recognise that these people they're not perfect. In fact, they make a lot of mistakes like every other nation. Politically, they don't always do the right thing. They don't always treat the Palestinian peoples well, even though God told them 36 times in the Old Testament that they needed to remember that they had been slaves in Egypt and they needed to treat the foreigner like one in their midst. They don't always remember that. They're politicians. There's quite a few Israeli politicians in jail for corruption, but at least they're in jail for corruption. They actually get dealt with. It's not a perfect nation, but neither are we Christians perfect. And we're all on a journey to God in God's great redemptive purposes. So in a sense, they're grace gifts to remind the world and us that God's word is true, that he keeps his promises, and that they have a part to fulfill this call. And they're always going to remain a people who dwell apart. So anti-Israelism today has 4 modes of expressing itself. The media, you will always find that even if Israel has been injured in some way, it will always start with, the media will put it that the Palestinians were, this happened to the Palestinians, and then as a little aside, who had sent 400 rockets over into Sderot, hitting kindergartens and so on. But it's sort of like a little afterthought, just to a little bit of truth in there. So the media have a lot to play. They're generally very anti-Israel. Politicians, our Australian politicians, I don't know about here, but generally our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister will speak up and will often point the truth to what's happening with Hamas and so on. Also, Islamic fundamentalism is an expression of anti-Israelism today, mostly because in Islamic understanding, they don't believe that once a country or an area has been under Islam, they believe that if they lose that area, they are duty-bound to honour Allah by getting it back. So the world for Islam is divided into Dar al-Islam, the abode of Islam, and Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, anywhere else. And so this is why you have this anti-Israelism today as well, because for the Muslim people, they see this tiny little land in the midst of an area 640 times greater as an insult to Islam, because they just feel it actually shouldn't be there. And sadly, many in the church don't understand God's special call for this people, for this land, and for this city. There's also a number of well-meaning Jews who desperately want to be like the nations, and they can be as anti-Semitic as anybody else, or as anti-Israel as anybody else. But there's also another very insidious thing that's happening at the moment, and that is the BDS movement. And I've got a couple of film clips to show you shortly. But the BDS movement was started generally by members of different churches, the Presbyterian Church in America, some Lutheran Church, some parts of the Anglican Church, and it means boycott. It encourages people to boycott Israeli products and anything to do with Israel, to divest, again to really avoid anything Israeli, and to apply sanctions. So if somebody, a pop group says they're going to play a concert in Tel Aviv, the BDS movement get really on the bandwagon, and they try to force them. They do a whole campaign on social media to try and stop them from doing that. And I really loved that the Rolling Stones, when they tried to force the Rolling Stones to cancel their concerts in Tel Aviv, and Mick Jagger said, well, we'd planned to do one, but we're going to do two. And people like Paul McCartney stood up and said they're not going to stop us from going to play in Tel Aviv. But they also suggest that we should never buy Israeli products. But the problem with all of that is that they don't understand that our cell phones and all of the technology that we have in IT, most of it has come from Israel. Our GPS trackers, we're going to get lost if we divest ourselves of our GPSs and our Google Maps. That most of the amazing medical breakthroughs that are happening for Parkinson's disease and in early detection of cancer are coming out of hospitals in Israel. So basically you have to go back to the Middle Ages if you think that you're going to divest yourself from anything that Israel has had anything to do with. So there's a battle for truth going on in our day. And this is part of the battle tactics in the war against the Jews. In 2 Timothy 4:4, it speaks of a time when people will stop listening to the truth and turn aside to follow myths. And the Nazi Goebbels says, if a lie is big enough and repeated often enough, it will be believed. And that's exactly what happened through the Holocaust. So it's time for we Christians, I believe, to stand with the Jewish people, with the nation of Israel, with the city of Jerusalem, because to stand with them is to stand with God's purposes. It doesn't mean we believe everything they do is right, but we do see them as God's redemptive people. Anything else is to participate in the unholy war against the Jews and to miss out on seeing God's miracle, the Jewish people who are still here today. So I just want you to have a look at a couple of YouTube clips by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. He was, he's probably one of the best Bible scholars of Old Testament that you'll ever come across. and you can find his website, some amazing teaching. He's not a believer in Jesus. He has had amazing opportunities to speak with members of the royal family, with the House of Lords, has done an excellent talk on what's happening to education with children. And these are a couple of clips on anti-Semitism and the BDS movement. Thanks, Tim. So I think you'll agree that they were both really made, it really made it very clear and simple what anti-Semitism is all about, the new anti-Semitism, and also the BDS movement.
The offering will be towards a specific work that John and Jesma are doing, and I'll get her just to comment on that really quick.
Okay, we work in Malawi, in Kenya, in Calcutta, and in Andhra Pradesh, and in Israel, partnering with in-country people, particularly in delivering education and healthcare and vocational training to women and children and their communities. So John and I established an organisation called Neighbours Aid Community Stores, 2002, and we raise most of our funds through 6 opportunity shops in Australia and 2 in Fiji. And what else? We have 280 volunteers and 16 paid staff, and at the moment we're just about to open another school in a slum in Calcutta. There's between 3,000 and 5,000 slums in Calcutta, and many of the children are left on the streets when their parents go to day labourers. So we establish little schools there that become like community centres, which also provide medical care and food for the families and for the older children. So that's John and I don't take anything for ourselves in when I come to speak. So anything that you might feel you want to give, we'll go to that.